All right, Chris Peaks here, back to my buddy Chris. Hadn't talked to him in a while. We're gonna have one of our Civil War chats. Something a little bit different than that. We're gonna talk about some generals and their strategies. Chris, how are you, my man?
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
I'm okay. So I guess the first one we should probably touch on is General Scott's strategy. The Anaconda plan. What's your thoughts on that?
Um, I mean, it's pretty ambitious. The United States Navy, I don't think had enough ships to do it in 1861. I mean, I'm cribbing a lot from James McPherson here, I think. Battle Cry of Freedom. It's been a long time, but um, let's remember that Scott was a Virginian, right? And like most Virginia regular officers, he was loyal to the Union. Lee was actually more of an exception than a rule on that one, at least when it comes to executive officers and senior officers. But he probably wanted that approach, and again, I'm coming from McPherson, because he uh, didn't want to he didn't want to fight his fellow Southerners. I mean, right?
Right.
Like it's was brutal. And the Anaconda plan would, at least by all appearances, offer an opportunity to avoid that outcome. But the problem with that is a blockade is not really effective unless you actually seize the ports, and that requires fighting. And then the other problem is you need a hell of a lot of ships. If memory serves, at the beginning of the war, 7 out of 8 blockade runners were able to slip through the federal noose. By the time you get to 1865, where the Federals have taken the vast majority of ports, have closed off the Mississippi, you're still about a 50% chance. Now, that's still going to really hurt blockade running. It disincentivizes the effort. And again, it's a pretty significant cut in trade. But is that alone enough to win the war? I don't think so.
I think 1860, you had Mobile was still open, Charleston was still open. I mean, you had so many ports that was still open till the latter part of the war.
Exactly. I mean, it's not till February of 65 with the capture of Wilmington that they finally are able to actually cut the last federal Confederate port. And that's, 3 months before the war is effectively over. So realistically, I think it played a huge role in the collapse of the Confederate economy. And the collapse of the Confederate economy is a huge role in instability on the Confederate home front, which itself plays a significant role in Confederate desertion, not to mention Confederate soldiers often going a year or more without being paid. These are all factors. So Anaconda Plan is absolutely critical to Union success. But the idea that the Anaconda Plan would in and of itself achieve success, I mean, I think that was it's really sad, but I think that was the fantasy of a man who genuinely was horrified to be have to fight this war, and my heart goes out to Scott for that.
The thing about it is, when you look at it, okay, yeah, it's like, but it would take so long
Yeah,
for all these people to fall in love. And when the one thing too, yeah, I think he was still caught up in a lot of the European style warfare where you capture the other guy's capital and that's going to end the war. That wasn't the case in this. I mean, if they'd have caught Richmond and early on, I don't think that would have been the war. They just moved the capital elsewhere.
I mean, who's to say, right? I know that was Davis's perspective, right? Like very famously, when McClellan initiates the Urbana campaign, he asks Lee where should the Confederates establish his next capital, and Lee responds Danville would be the logical choice. And that's when Lee famously slams his hand on the desk and tears in his eyes and said, "Richmond must not fall." Um, that being said, the question for Davis, especially if it's early war, let's say, for example, at the Battle of Manassas Junction, let's just say the Union wins the battle, and they move on Richmond. If they win that early battle and they capture Richmond, is there a chance of recalcitrant rebels? Like, will the bellwether states, who are very reluctant to join rebellion and begin with, will they then break away? Is Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, are they going to stay in this Confederate experiment if the capital is seized so early? I don't know if they do, because the
I
Confederacy.
think you're right. I think had it went, with either one of them, Confederate seized Washington or that both would have fell apart.
Sorry?
I think had the Union captured Richmond, or vice versa, had the Confederates seized Washington that day, I think both of the war efforts would have fell apart.
I don't know. I think for the Confederacy, I could see it. The thing with the Union is where are the Union states going to go, right? Like Wisconsin isn't going to secede to Canada,
Right.
as much as we'd appreciate their cheese. But the Confederate states, they're in a rebellion. They're out of their normal practical relations, and the
Yeah.
act of rebellion, whether it be revolutionary or not. And Davis was very careful in his language to eschew any mention of revolution. The Confederate cause is not a revolutionary cause. It's quite the opposite. But in any act of insurrection, being out of your normal relation with the law, you are in a position of vulnerability. I don't know who this read a. Oh, that's interesting. Cool. I mean, I don't like AI, but all right. It's anyway. Back to what I was saying. It's much easier for a rebel state to make the decision to rejoin the Union and mitigate losses. So I think the Confederacy in 1861 is a much more fragile alliance than the Union. Now, had the Union, Washington, D.C. been captured, it would have been a profound crisis, but would there have been enough upwards pressure on the Lincoln government to suspend the war? Lincoln was very firm on this issue, and we have an historical laboratory for that, and that is the Battle of Bladensburg in the War of 1812, where the capital did in fact fall and was burned by the British, and that did not result in American capitulation.
What
So
happens if what happens if the capital falls and the Union government's captured?
that'd be bad, but it's also important to remember there's a pretty significant garrison in Washington, D.C. I don't think there's any event that leads to that. If the Lincoln government's captured and the government's decapitated, then yeah, I suspect in that case the Confederates win, but I don't really see how that's possible. There was a fairly substantial Union garrison defending Washington, and the Army of
You're in
Northeastern.
1861.
Sorry?
You're in 1860 in the Battle of First Manassas. There was a garrison defending one. Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Talking about 61. After the Battle of Manassas, I don't think there's a hope in hell of capturing Washington at any point. The garrison there is as high as I think 50,000.
Well, I'll pick off topic here. But I've read so many reports that Jubal, when he went there in '64, for a moment the Capitol lay empty. I was looking at one of the commanders. He said for the first like 12 hours or something, Jubal Early could have walked into DC anytime that he wanted to, and there was nothing there to defend them.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate series of circumstances. It's true. He actually might have had a chance. Colonel Elijah Hunt Rhodes famously said, "Yeah, he said, but Early was late." Yeah, that's perfect. But that's because during the Overland campaign, Grant was able to convince Lincoln to authorize him to take the Washington garrison and put it in the field. This is the famous heavy artillery that suffers overwhelming casualties at Cold Harbor because they have something to prove and they have no tactical experience. Combine that with rifle pits, and you get the same kind of enormous losses as the Americans on the Western Front in 1917. But because of that, the garrison was very weak. And Lincoln did this because Grant was maintaining the initiative. So in theory, Lee had no troops to spare to attack Washington City. But yeah, it would be because of the Battle of Monocacy that held back the rebels long enough for the Federals to reinforce Fort Stevens and the surrounding forts, and then they're able to throw Jubal Early off. But yes, that is true. In that campaign, if Early was able to push through Monocacy quickly, he could have raided the capital. Now, of course, while he's there with his Second Corps, we have to remember Sheridan's Cavalry Corps and the Sixth Corps and elements of the garrison are all on their way to kick the crap out of him, and they're going to cut off his lines of communication, which means there's no way he occupies it. He will have to withdraw through the Shenandoah Valley. So he's not holding it. But yes, he could have, like the British in 1814, burned it down. Do I think that would have changed the outcome of the war? Maybe, if it caused Lincoln to lose the election of 1864. It is extremely important. Would the Union have lost because the capital was captured? No. Would they have lost if the immolation of the Capitol resulted in Lincoln's electoral defeat? Yes. But then we still have to consider A, Jubal Early's forces will be driven back. B, in this counterfactual, there's the possibility of a third Winchester battle at an even greater level, where the corps might even be annihilated, which is certainly a soothing balm for the loss of Washington. We still have the capture of Atlanta, and all that. I think Lincoln still got a pretty good shot.
Let's switch to Confederate strategy. Jefferson Davis was the chief strategist.
Yeah.
So he almost had a violated what Frederick the Great's "He who defends everything defends nothing." I mean, static river defense. What then? Defensive, offensive type strategy. I mean,
yeah. What was that?
A defensive draw defense and then go on offense.
Yeah, offensive defensive, which is messy. It's always been a very nebulous term. If we're talking rebel strategy, and I'm cribbing now from Donald Stoker and his wonderful book, The Grand Design, which I refer to a lot. Really, if you're interested in this stuff, read it. It's so good. But and a few others. Davis, Stephen Woodworth as well. Also cribbing from him. T. Harry Williams suggests the term cordon defense for the first phase of Confederate defense. And that's where the Confederates do, he who defends everything loses all. A perfect quote for it, where the rebel forces are scattered amongst the vast area of operations, which which is the Southern Confederacy. It's important to note that the Confederates' claimed territory was about 60% of the United States. It is a territory, in some ways at least, comparable to Russia in terms of size. It's massive, and they don't have the forces for it. And the problem, though, is politics. For Davis to make his insurrection work, he needs the state governors to support him. And that was a lot harder to achieve than it sounds on paper. Each of those state governors had very different interests, very different concerns, most of which redounded to, is my state safe? But you can't protect every state. And if you spread your forces along this cordon defense, what that means is the Federals can select whatever tiny garrison they want to annihilate and then move forward functionally without opposition. This strategy really falls apart in early 62. I think the collapse of the Bowling Green line was kind of a pretty obvious, augured very poorly for this strategy. That was after the Battle of Logan's Crossroads in early February 1865. Sorry, 65, blah, 62. Sorry, 1862, not 5. When the cordon defense begins to fail, they adopt that offensive defensive, which is a really nebulous term, which, as far as I understand it, basically comes down to broad defensive strategy, offensive operation. So the Confederate military doctrine, if they ever had one at all, which is debatable, is fall back, consolidate, counterattack lines of communication. Which it works in a lot of cases, but in a time, literally gives orders to Beauregard to respond to Sherman's march to the sea. Beauregard responds to Davis. General Sherman has no lines of communication because he didn't. So the response is sort of a modern warfare strategy. But the problem with the Confederates is they never get beyond operational level thinking. The Federals are advancing here. Okay, consolidate, attack the lines of communication, throw them back, right? If they take the initiative, we know where to react. We can consolidate our forces there, and we can drive them back with offensive operation. And that does work to a point, but there's never a cohesive strategy. How does this result in victory? And they never really have one.
Let me ask you this. It was like, hold on. All South Carolina hold out. Well, when you're outnumbered and the vast majority of supplies lie with the Union, I know Jackson's seen this, and Lee did to an extent with his invasions, but if Jackson had more to do with the strategy, because I know on day one he wanted to pursue, shouldn't you have if you're having a rebellion, you're trying to break away. Shouldn't you take the initiative and say, okay, we're going to take the fight to you, and
Yeah.
we're going to make you, because you had a North that was, you know, some was behind, some not. You know, you don't take the fight to them, defeat them on their own soil, and just destroy them, their morale.
Well, you just described Lee's strategy perfectly, and I'm a bit of a contrarian on this because right now, at least the popular opinion is Lee was a terrible general. I don't agree. I think Lee's strategy was sound; it just didn't work. But there's kind of two schools of thought to this. So you have the Fabian approach and you have the fast action gambler approach, right? I'm sure there's a smarter term for that. Let's call it the Napoleonic approach. In fact, I'm going to, because then I'll get to sound smart. So Fabian strategy is named after General Fabius, who is one of the
Hey,
Roman.
let's do the Fabian when we go to Johnston.
Sorry?
Touch on the other one first. Let's do the Fabian when we go to Johnston.
Yeah. So Fabius, for those who watch this and want to know the context, he was a general during the Second Punic War. Now, the Second Punic War was the most famous of the Punic Wars against between the Romans and the Carthaginians, where the Carthaginian general Hannibal was able to bring his forces to bear against Rome on the Mediterranean peninsula itself, which was a crisis for Rome. And after Hannibal had dealt quite effectively with some of Rome's best consul generals, Fabius adopted a strategy of delay, where instead of giving Hannibal major battle, such as the Battle of Cannae, which was Hannibal's most extraordinary victory, instead he would fall back, harass, delay. In that time, Scipio Africanus was able to gather his forces and counterattack and annihilate Hannibal. Now, that's an oversimplification. And I'm sure I got things wrong there, but that's the basics of it. So Fabianism in general means slowly exhausting your opponent, working your way through incremental victories. And that's Johnston's strategy. And Grant, I believe, in his memoirs, observes that Johnston's strategy of Fabianism was the best strategy for the immediate survival of the Confederacy and also guaranteed to cause this inevitable defeat.
Well, one thing else I like to point out about Johnston, I made this argument. I've got some people like said, okay, you know, you're making a good point. The South should have never tried to defend the Mississippi River. They lost 100,000 men and over 100 big guns. When New Orleans fell, there was no sense in trying to defend it. Once New Orleans gone, Johnston seen this and ordered Pemberton to break out from Vicksburg. You know, and, to save his army. He followed Davis's orders instead. You know, 40,000 men at Fort Hudson later. I mean, Johnston seen that this was a waste. I mean, save your army, survive in advance.
But the problem with Johnston is Johnston never saw a retreat he didn't fall in love with. If you were to ask President Davis, Davis would respond that Johnston should have taken his forces, combined the forces of the Trans-Mississippi, and should have aided Pemberton and struck the Federals from both sides. And honestly, I'm more on Davis's side on this one.
I didn't know that. I didn't know he said that.
Hmm?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that's what Davis wanted Johnston to do. Really,
Davis was furious. In fact, the reason Johnston is removed from command and won't take command again until 65 is because Davis holds Johnston personally accountable for the loss of Vicksburg. And I see the logic of what Johnston was saying, but Johnston never made a real attempt to save Vicksburg. And sometimes you do have to actually try to relieve a garrison that's under siege as opposed to retreat. The loss of Vicksburg, I mean, I think Vicksburg gets a little bit exaggerated in the historical narrative. I think Chattanooga is more important, at least for, you know, a more modern, evolving technological war, which is relying less on rivers and more on rail. But nevertheless, Vicksburg is a key strategic position. It's a massive loss for the rebels, and it was worth fighting for.
but didn't Johnston, wasn't his command only basically on paper only? I mean, didn't he only have like 5 or 10,000 men?
He had more than that, as I recollect, but I couldn't give you the numbers. He had command of the entire department, right? So if he had concentrated, and again, it's a desk, but this is the difference in Lee and Johnson. To steal a phrase from McPherson, Again, cribbing from Battle Cry of Freedom here, but I love this quote. Uh, it's only slightly facetious to say that if General Johnston had been in supreme command of Confederate strategy, the key battle of the Civil War would have been Key West, Florida.
I love that. Um,
It could only retreat so much. And Lee's strategy is the opposite. Lee's strategy is what you were saying earlier: maintain operational initiative. Um, Prevent the Federals from gaining the advantage. The Federals have a larger military force, they have greater resources, they also have a much, much, much more difficult military project to achieve. That's their weakness. So if you can keep them off balance, if you can prevent them from concentrating and from cooperating their various forces and attacking Confederate centers of gravity being weaknesses, simultaneously, you can prevent them from exploiting Confederate weakness. If I attack them in Pennsylvania and drive them back, then yes, I can spare 30,000 troops to fight them in Tennessee. 1863 is a good example of this. Despite the failure of Gettysburg, and Gettysburg is a tactical nightmare, nevertheless, the success, or not success, but the Pennsylvania campaign in and of itself is able to disrupt federal operations in Virginia enough that, yeah, Lee can actually spare Longstreet's corps, albeit reluctantly, and they can in turn win the Battle of Chickamauga and in turn suspend or at least delay federal operations in Tennessee by effectively a year. It takes, or at least 6 months, takes the rest of the campaigning season for Grant to fix the mess caused by the Battle of Chickamauga. This is only possible if you're keeping up an initiative. Otherwise, federal forces can make simultaneous offensives, and you don't have the capital to stop all of them. And you can adopt a Fabian strategy where you make it difficult and slowly whittle them away, but they have the numbers, they have the logistics, and they have the spirit. They, despite what you might ask a Confederate about the Yankees, they are absolutely ready to win this war. So a Fabian strategy is not going to work long term.
um,
In taking the initiative and disrupting federal operations with the possibility of undermining their war effort before it can reach its what's what we're looking for, reach its maximum, if you say, reach its zenith, is
pass,
in the early war the best strategy. It just didn't work, but I think Lee's strategic thinking is actually sound.
Johnston gave up, and I agree with you. There's only so much ground you can give up. I mean, once
Yeah,
he got to Atlanta, what was going to be Augusta or
and
Macon?
remember that as he's losing that land, just to be clear, it's not just land. Like, it's very easy for us to kind of get into
Oh
this kind
yeah, he's
of,
losing crop land, labor.
remember
Yeah,
that in 63, Braxton Bragg is complaining about the fact that 60% of his beef cattle is going to Virginia. Lee's army is feeding off of Georgia. Lee's army is feeding off of southern Tennessee. You lose that ground, you're not getting it back. You're losing access to material, access to men, and potentially you're losing support from the Confederacy. It's a serious loss. Now, just to be clear, there's other problems here. The biggest problem in the West is, where do you take the initiative and how do you prevent the Federals from advancing against you with an area of operation so massive? Personally, I think I like to, and this is an oversimplification, I kind of see it as a shield and a sword. For the Confederacy, the shield is the West, the sword is the East. You have to hold back the Federals as best you can in the West and strike the deadly blows in the East, where the area of operation is only 100 miles, where you can concentrate your troops easily and strike deadly blows against centers of gravity that are available without surrendering the capacity to react to Federal operations. Whereas in the West, it's really massive. In the West, it makes more sense to me to hold on and to take an offensive defensive strategy, but it has to be with alacrity. Whereas the Federals, their sword and shield is the reverse. The West is where the Confederacy is weak. It's too large a territory for them to defend, and they desperately need it at the same time. Whereas the East is where they're strong. A smaller force can operate very quickly and attack multiple centers of gravity very rapidly. Just my way of looking at it, but I see it as kind of a sword and a shield on kind of asymmetrical relationship.
So let me go ask you this right here. Something I touched on earlier. When Johnston is relieved and General Hood takes command, and
Yeah.
I know a lot of people criticize General Hood. I'm not as hard on him as some because he was put in position to attack, and he throws a Hail Mary or he throws an interception in the end zone.
Yeah, you could say
Davis
that.
wanted to do that. Finally, we're going to take the fight to the north. He abandons his supply lines and goes north. Why don't we do this? Why was this not done in 1862? Why are we waiting until the last minute?
But it was done in 1862.
No, I mean, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, but why do we, why do we not continue this throughout the war instead of just retreating? I mean, why are we not taking the fight? Southerners not taking the fight in the north.
Well, that's General Johnston and Fabianism, right? Like Johnston's doctrine was the defense. Bragg makes an effort in 62. It comes to naught, which is what makes me amazed by Hood. When Hood proposes moving into Kentucky and raising 20,000 troops, one almost wants to shake him and ask him if he's aware of the fact that Bragg tried that 2 years ago when the Confederacy was in much better shape. Why would 20,000 Kentuckians turn out for you now in 64 when you're losing the war? Why would they do it now when they wouldn't in 62 when you were winning? As Bragg said, the cows are too fat in Kentucky.
So let me ask you this. When Hood moves north, Sherman's kind of stunned there for a minute, right? I mean,
yeah.
I know he's I don't think he ever thought about following him, but he's got to be stunned. This army moves there. So then he comes up with his own strategy.
Well, it's the most
bold and ambitious to abandon your supply lines and live off the land.
Oh, hugely. It's the biggest risk of the entire war, and it's also the most brilliant campaign of the war. One that was so daring that
you're on an island there. You abandon the supply lines. That's a long march from Atlanta to Savannah.
And if your army gets bogged down for 3 days, you're screwed. It's really dangerous. But that's why, as Hood said, my God, if not Hood, sorry, Sherman said, if General Hood will march north, I'll give him rations myself. It's the worst possible move Hood could have made. And the only reason Sherman can do it is because Hood is moving north. And this might answer your question. Why not do it in the West? Well, here's your problem. In the East, there are other operational armies, obviously. There's the Union Army of the South, for example. There's the Army of the Peninsula. But its primary army is the Army of the Potomac, right? We go to the West, we have the Army of the Ohio, Cumberland. I mean, the Ohio sometimes becomes the Cumberland. And, of course, the Army of the Tennessee. Sherman knows he has more than a sufficient number of troops waiting in Tennessee to give Hood a warm reception. So he doesn't need to pursue Hood. And when Hood leaves Tennessee, he gives Sherman essentially permission to initiate the most bold and audacious campaign of the war. As I said, Sherman can't get locked down for more than 3 days because his army cannot survive on the land for that long. They will eat out all the sustenance like a biblical locust. They will eat it all out in a couple of days. They can't do it. They can't stay. But the Confederates lack the kinetic force necessary to lock Sherman down. As Johnston will say in 65, all I could do is annoy him. And that's when Johnston has the shattered remnants of Hood's army. Before then, it's only scattered partisan forces, local militia, wheelers, small cavalry corps. That's totally insufficient, which means Sherman can make the march. No, Hood's
you had that militia home guard unit in Georgia. They suffered tremendous casualties.
Horrible.
Like it was about 4,000, bunch of old men and boys. That went in there and tried to stop his army.
Are you thinking Griswoldsville and Macon?
I think that is it. Yeah, I watched that on. I watched Sherman's March. They had a thing on that with that unit, which they should have never went up there and tried.
Oh, do you mean
never tried to challenge them?
The 2008 history documentary? Fantastic. Absolutely recommend it. Love that documentary. Yeah, no, and they don't have the force necessary to stop the Army of the Tennessee. Not at that stage. And that's how you can do something like Sherman's March, which was, as I said, Sherman's March is from my understanding, and again, I'm just spouting off my interpretation of these things, but I see Sherman's March as being the closest event in the Civil War to modern warfare. I reject the
Yeah, I
notion that
agree.
it's war. I reject that entirely. It's not, in my opinion, but it is certainly modern warfare insofar as it's targeting enemy infrastructure, and it's also targeting enemy morale. As Sherman says, this march will be an act not of war, but of statesmanship. We will show the people of the Confederacy and the world that their government cannot protect them. And that's exactly what he does. As along with his operational objective of changing his base to Savannah so he can ideally support the Grant's war against Lee. Of course, by the time he gets there, it's already over. But Lee's days were numbered either way. But the damage he does to rebel infrastructure and rebel morale, I think, really cannot be overstated. And that's what makes it so brilliant. Arguably Sherman's campaign, march through Georgia and then march to the Carolinas, respectively, those two campaigns really do more damage to the Confederacy, I think, than any other singular campaign with the least casualties. And again, I don't want to pretend I'm an expert here, but it seems to me that one of the reasons that Sherman can do it is because General Hood decided to have a little vacation in Tennessee with fantasies of taking Washington.
Let me ask you this. It may be a little political, but it still falls into a military strategy. Um, Patrick Claiborne.
Yeah.
What about if the Davis issues? What if you armed the slaves in 1863? Does that work?
Well, 64, I think, is when he proposes it. It,
Okay.
I don't think that works. I'm gonna be right back. I'm gonna top this beverage off one last time, and then I will explain why. But yeah, I don't think it works to do that. All right, be right back. All right.
Before you tell this, I don't know if you before Claiborne though, there was a congressman from Alabama. I can't remember his name.
Mm-hmm.
But it was right after, I think it was in July of '63, after the debacles of June. He sent Davis a letter urging him to do that, and he said, "We're going to lose our slaves one way or the other. We're going to lose them to this war." Like I said, or we can free them at all. He urged him to do that. But, let me say something. Would you like to have been
Richard Ewell, I think, also floated the idea in '61. But
who did?
I've read, and I've never looked into it, but I've read that Richard Ewell actually floated the idea really early in the war, but he was not.
If memory serves me correctly from this book I read, soldiers is no soldiers was found, no army was found. I can't remember it. But I suppose on the first day of Manassas, he mentioned it to Davis.
Yeah,
and
very
like Davis was blasphemy. But let me ask, would you like to have been the Confederate officer that walked onto a plantation with 100 slaves and said, "Okay, we're going to teach you how to shoot"?
Yeah, really. No, I would not. Why it wouldn't work? I mean, there's a lot of reasons. Mary Chestnut, and again, this is a white slaveholder's diary, so you have to, have a grain of skepticism. But I'm gonna just believe her for the sake of conversation. She, I think it was Chestnut, said that in '61, she asked her slaves, "Would you fight for the Confederacy in return for your freedom?" And the response was, "Yeah." Now, remember, they're going to give her the answer they want. To quote the wonderful novel, The Good Lord Bird, I'm going to change a bit of the language here to be, I'm not going to use the racial epithets, but as the Good Lord Bird put it, never had a black person ever benefited from telling the truth to a white person. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, according to Chestnut, they responded, yeah, we would. The same question was posed in '65, and the response essentially was, no, the Federals are going to be here soon. So your first question is, in '64, how many are willing to actually do it? But beyond that, the big problem comes down to Clausewitz's first dictum. War is the extension of policy by other means, right? That
Right.
fundamentally the purpose of war is to enact and enforce a political policy. And strategy only works when that act of war is aligned with that policy. And the idea of freeing the slaves to win the Civil War is a contradiction of Confederate policy, as Howell Cobb so perfectly expresses it in the secret session of Congress to debate the very issue of Cleburne's letter, quote, if slaves make for good soldiers and soldiers can be made of slaves, then our entire theory, indeed, our entire revolution is wrong. And yeah, he's right. For once, when a unique experience for him, it was wrong. And it's totally contradictory. It's anathema to the very purpose of secession. Now, Lee will propose this in 65 on that same basis, as you mentioned in 63. We're going to lose all our slaves. May as well try to keep something. But nevertheless, even when Lee proposes it and the Confederate Congress enables it, the Confederate Congress merely allows the states to decide for themselves, do you want to recruit slaves with the promise of freedom, which is a contradiction of the Confederate States Constitution, Article 4, Section 9, if memory serves. I probably got that wrong, which makes it illegal for states or the Confederate Congress itself to abolish slavery in any form. So it's a pretty significant act in and of itself. But even then, the Confederate Congress is not prepared to universally raise black troops. And it's only the state of Virginia that takes them up on it. So even if Cleburne's idea was to be accepted, there is such reluctance that it's very difficult to imagine that coalescing in any significant military force. Then you have the problem that many black folks are going to understand that federal liberation is on its way. Then you have the fact that many black soldiers would probably desert to federal lines as soon as possible. And then you have the problem that most of the Confederate States governments would not accept this as a strategy because it makes the entire purpose of the rebellion meaningless. So there's such a discordance between the purpose of the war and its function that I just don't think it works. I don't think there's any situation where the limited abolition of slavery would have function. I know there's historical parallels with the American Revolution, but it's important to note the American Revolution, while the preservation of slavery was definitely a part of the revolution was primarily fought on the policy issue of English liberty. And only some portions of the Continental Force of 1776 had significant enslaved population. Very different in the Confederacy. So no, I don't think that would have worked. I don't think.
Let me ask you this: had they had a different policy in 1861
Sorry,
regarding free blacks
a different cause?
and a different policy
Well, I mean,
regarding because you got the first Louisiana Native Guard that was, they was even up until 1862 was still serving New Orleans. So they disbanded them.
well,
Aren't you?
sorry, two different things. The Native Guard was disbanded pretty much as soon as it was formed. The governor of Louisiana, I can't remember his name right now, he did appoint them a white colonel, but as soon as word reached Richmond of its organization, he was told in no uncertain terms that the men were to be disbanded and disarmed immediately. So they weren't really in service very long, but be that as it may, if the Confederacy seceded on a different cause, I mean, I suppose, but there's really no issue outside of slavery that would have caused Southern secession to begin with. So it's, I mean, I guess if we were to wave a magic wand and they seceded because they thought that Abraham Lincoln's feet were too big or something, then sure. But it's just that none of that really plays out historically, right? Like slavery is so fundamentally enmeshed in the Confederate cause that they're indissoluble from each other. It is the purpose of Southern rebellion. Yeah, as Stevens acknowledged, I believe in the Cornerstone speech, this issue isn't about tariffs. This is about slavery. Hell, Stevens himself was a supporter of the moral tariff, for God's sake. And if we're looking at tax revenue, New York Harbor paid the vast majority of trade taxes, not the southern states. No, the issue was slavery, and there's really no other singular issue that would have led to a secession movement. Not in my opinion, at least. So I don't see a situation where the Confederate States do secede unless it's over slavery. And if the issue is slavery, then we have that fundamental discontinuity between policy and strategy. And call me a simpleton, but I think Clausewitz is absolutely right on that issue. There has to be a concordance between the two. Incontinence, an incontinence between the two necessarily result in strategic breakdown.
All right, so let's go to. I love the pissing contest that the Southerners and Northerners get in about him. General Grant. He's seen the big picture, right? I've got the most men, the most forces. I'm going to bring them to bear. What do you tell me? Wherever he goes, you go, or where?
Yep.
Lee,
General Lee and not Richmond.
Yeah, he is destroy the Confederate Army.
Yeah.
Why did it take him so long to figure that out?
Wait, why did it take Grant so long during the campaign, or why did it take them?
Grant? I think Grant knew it from the beginning. Why did it take the North this long to figure the Northern generals on the East to figure, before we came there? Why didn't nobody else realize this? We got to go destroy Lee's army. Because every one of them, Hooker, Meade, McClellan, Richmond.
That's a really good question.
Hooker, McClellan. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's a good question. I think part of it is that marriage to what you aptly call the European style of warfare. The Civil War is very much a Napoleonic War, and it's not very revolutionary military strategy. It's really not. And they are married to these basic Jeminian concepts, including capture the enemy's capital. For whatever it's worth, McClellan did actually propose a grand strategy of simultaneous offensives, not entirely dissimilar to Grant's, except McClellan's grandiloquently put him at the command of the critical army of the Potomac and the capture of Richmond. But he's the only one to really propose a serious grand strategy until Grant. Part of it is the fact that Halleck was, I think, a poor choice for general-in-chief, and Stanton and Lincoln weren't really up to the task of doing that and administering the government at the same time, which is understandable. That's the period Halleck and Stanton, Lincoln and Stanton kind of play the role of general-in-chief along with their other duties until Halleck is appointed as the general-in-chief. So I think part of it is the man hadn't met the hour. And I think also it's because of the way the Civil War escalates. In the first years of the Civil War, there's still this hope that this can be resolved on, as McClellan would say, the highest terms of Christian morality. The war goes through various permutations from kind of the phony war period of 1861 to war in earnest in 62 to 63 till at last hard war in 1864. And I think you need to have that hard war mentality to recognize that the Confederate States Army was effectively an insurgency. And to defeat the insurgency, you have to defeat the insurgent army itself. That being said, it does kind of get truly slippery because it's important to note that the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia is destroyed basically within the same 2-week span as Richmond is captured. So that becomes sort of indissoluble as well. I mean, if Lee's army escaped and Richmond had had been captured, Davis ludicrously, as he himself would recognize was perhaps overly sanguine, would say, freed from the responsibility of defending our cities, the Confederate Army can now operate freely. Okay, so
Danville, right?
Oh man, like that's like, buddy, wow, I wish I had that optimism. That's got to be so great to really. That's looking down the barrel of the gun and finding the silver lining in the rifling. Like that's amazing. But
around the base.
Could Lee's army, if Lee's army escapes, let's say they get across the Appomattox, could they really, at that point, have maintained a conventional war with the loss of Petersburg and Richmond as bases of operations? I don't know, man. So maybe capturing the
Where are you
capital.
going to supply it? Where are you going to resupply? Where you got to have a, like I said, a center of operations? Where are you going to, and this was probably falls into strategy too. And I tell people this was not true. It's a myth. Um, Lee was trying to link up with Johnston. I said, no, that was discussed one time in a cabinet meeting. It was only in passing. I said, how would they link up? Where are you going to communicate? Where are you going to coordinate this link up spot at? Okay, there's no way to do that's military, and then you're going to be put in the vice grips between two military forces that's basically 4 times your size. No, Lee to me was feed, get some distance between me and Grant, and I'll figure the rest out later. He was just living for the moment.
Oh, yeah, no, it's a forlorn hope. I do think linking with Johnston is the obvious thing to do, but no, like as you said, now you have the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, all on you simultaneously. There's not a lot of wiggle room. I mean, maybe if you take your dice and roll like a nat 20, maybe you drive. That's a little Dungeons and Dragons reference for anyone who's watching and knows that. Maybe you drive Sherman's army back and then you can consolidate against Grant, but these are not generals that are going to be overawed by shock and awe. They're going to consolidate and counterattack again. No, I agree with you. By the time you get to 65, writing's on the wall. And Lee would agree as well. Lee advocated for surrender, I believe, in January of 65, as early as. Because really at that point, I would go so far to say the Civil War is not truly over until Lee surrenders. There's always the possibility, but realistically, when Lincoln wins re-election, the Confederacy should have been negotiating for a settlement at that point. It's over. It's over.
So let me ask you this. This has been the final strategy. I actually wrote a short story on this. Um, at Appomattox, people praise Lee for putting whatever country first and training his army and didn't want a protracted war. Porter Alexander wanted him to take to the hills. Now, from what I've read, Lee entertained the idea momentarily.
Might have, but it's all right. I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, you're fine. What if he hadn't been totally surrounded? Would he still have surrendered, or would he take him to the hills? And how does that strategy play out now? If the Confederates launch a guerrilla war,
well, it brings us back to Clausewitz. As I recall, the exchange, something along the lines of Alexander says, why not order the men to take to the hills, 10 and 20 men in sections, and hold in the Blue Ridge Mountains? And Lee had at one point said, if I could reach the Blue Ridge Mountains, I could hold for 20 years, which I might mention, a real irony, that was John Brown's plan. But with John Brown, it's a logical plan because his plan is to establish a small maroon colony that's self-sustaining in order to achieve secession from the United States and establish itself as a free land for Black Americans until the US government recognizes their freedom. But for the Confederacy, that's not a logical strategy. Again, we're back to the purpose of the war. The purpose of the war is to maintain the structural hierarchy of the South, with the planter aristocracy at the head, with the yeoman class below them, unified by a rough equality of white men by the existence of a servile class of Black Americans, right? That's the broad Southern structure. You sacrifice that by turning to partisan warfare. The Confederates never, ever exercised command over their partisans. There's a question. William Clark Quantrill, you're familiar with him, right?
Oh yeah.
What was his rank?
Colonel.
Yeah, that's the funny thing. He was a captain.
Captain. Okay.
Called himself a colonel because he wanted to be a colonel. The Confederate Congress never authorized his promotion, so he just said, screw it, I'm a colonel. What are you going to do? And everyone calls him Colonel Quantrill, even though he was a captain. And that's kind of a microcosm of the relationship that the Confederates had with partisan warfare, which is they had no actual command or control over these people. When Sterling Price moves into Missouri in 1864 during his last campaign in Missouri, he doesn't command Bloody Bill Anderson to wreak havoc in northern Missouri. He asks him to. There's no command structure over the guerrillas. Now, if the purpose of the war is to maintain the structural social hierarchy of the South, then you can't give way to the social anarchy that is guerrilla warfare. Again, it's inconsistent. So it doesn't make any sense to call for that. There's also no long-term strategy for independence in that as well. Lee is correct when he observes that such warfare would wreak cruelty and havoc upon Virginia that, I can't remember exact words, but it basically says beyond description. So on the one level, you have a guarantee of a level of misery that Lee is not willing to inflict on his fellow white Virginians. And then the other problem is you have a total surrender, once again, of the basic premises upon which the war is being fought. The Confederate government considered disbanding their partisan operations in '62, but they realized they couldn't. They literally couldn't.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right.
Foxy had something he wasn't supposed to get. Let me ask you this. So the Confederate War after 1865, or mathematics, what was, or before that, were they still fighting for a racial hierarchy? I mean, because they'd already lost the slaves. Did they think they would be able to reestablish this one?
Oh yeah, 100%. Great example of this is the Kenner mission. As well as Mason and Slidell. So James Mason, I know you're familiar with him. Those of you, James Mason was the Confederate minister plenipotentiary in Britain. Davis wanted him we're talking like February, March '65, to give an informal offer of gradual emancipation in the Confederacy in return for British support. Now, this is the end of the war. Like, the writing is on the wall here. At this point, the Confederacy has already made an informal offer to literally to revert to a British colony like Canada in return for support. That they're willing to offer. But when Davis orders Mason to offer gradual emancipation, he can't do it. Mason can only bring himself to say something along the lines of, if there is any concern or discord between our countries preventing your support, we would be willing to ameliorate it. He wants Lord John Russell, who at this point wouldn't even meet him in the home state office, was meeting him in his parlor, to say, oh, slavery would be good to handle. That's how desperately they're clinging to this. When Davis approves the Kenner mission, and neo-Confederates love to cling to the Kenner mission would once again offer the British emancipation of the slaves in return for support. The Kenner mission is a secret mission, not authorized by Congress, having no diplomatic backbone. Literally, Davis privately offering, would this be of any interest? Because Davis knows, even in March of 1865, when the enemy is literally at the gates, the Confederate Congress is not going to approve of something like that. Yeah, they absolutely were fighting to maintain it.
What was the word? I'm not familiar with that Kenner mission. I have to look that up.
Yeah, it's just not very well known, but it's very interesting.
Very interesting.
A lot of neo-Confederates, because they're just desperate to find any example of the Confederacy using the word emancipation, totally misinterpret it. But what it really demonstrates is the dogged determination that the Confederates had to maintain their slaves right to the end. Even Lee, when Lee advocated for what he called basically limited emancipation, we'll free some of the slaves to make them soldiers, we don't lose all of them. The Confederate Congress is very reluctant to pass that. As I said, they wouldn't even actually directly authorize the recruitment of black soldiers, nor would they make freedom a condition of service. They merely allowed the states to do so with the recommendation of freedom. And as I recall, in Virginia's legislation, they too said that freedom is a suggested incentive.
Yeah, that was not guaranteed. Well, I cut this. I can tell you something about the antebellum group. I think that covers all the strategies, unless there's something we haven't touched on that you can think of.
No, there probably is, but I'm also getting really tired, so I'm happy to wrap it up.
It's been a pleasure, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. It was fun.